We're very happy to be presenting this, and we are so happy to have the people from Quito here, Lucas, Anad, and Ana. It's been quite an experience to do this project from afar, exhilarating, but also sometimes very difficult, and challenging, and even scary. So thank you for bringing a little bit of Ecuador back here for us, and a little bit of Mercado San Roque. We're just transferring a video before we start, but I'm also really glad we're going in this moment because I think what you'll see with our presentation is really a lot of connections coming together, and ours is structured a little bit differently. So much of the context has been given now, so many of these issues have been raised that we're not going to go into a lot of them. What we have... what we have been really concerned with a lot of this semester is the idea of representation, and a lot of other things that will come up that have been said, and thank you again so much to Jana and Ana for your conversation before, the idea of kind of inside and outside the market, the positionality of the organizations within the market, and how the market can respond either through resistance or defense or what that would mean, are all things I think that we'll kind of touch on as well. So our project is called Red de Mercados. And as you've seen, of course, in the previous presentations, Mercado San Roque is a contested space. But in this, it's not alone. Quito's other public markets face similar pressure by the forces of urbanization and globalization. For example, the pressure faced, or the pressures from the Super and Mega Maxis that seem to be popping up on every corner near the markets. And of course, this is challenging the market's consumer base. Instead of each market trying to defend itself individually, a strong intermarket solidarity network could facilitate the taking of collective action and build the most effective resistance to the marginalizing effects of local, regional, national, and international capital and power. An intermarket solidarity network is not actually our idea at all. It's something that is already being discussed in Quito and by some of the leaders of organizations within the market. And it was during our field work in Quito last January when we were able to attend a meeting between market leaders, which Zanny also brought up in her presentation, trying to kind of understand what it would mean to create solidarity across Quito's markets. And what they expressed, and again, what Zanny mentioned, is that it was difficult or nearly impossible because of the sense of disconnection, both between the markets and between groups within the markets. And through that conversation, several social issues came up that were either creating disconnection or seen as disconnected. And some of those were the threat of displacement faced by Quito's markets, as Zanny and Sinead have talked about, the unequal access to space within the market, which also came up during the previous panel discussion, the idea of informal and formal vendors, and who is able to have a formal post within the market versus who is pushed to the outside, and how that kind of challenges the boundary of the market, as well as the cost of actually buying a formal post are prohibitive to a lot of people. And the exploitation of wage laborers in the market, which Masoom has really talked about as well. And so we've taken this problematic of inter and intra-market disconnection as the basis for our thesis project and proposal. Ultimately, our proposal is an experiment in facilitating spaces of dialogue and collective meaning-making that would support the emergence of an active intermarket solidarity network. And of course, we'll get back to that after going through some other things.
But as you may remember from last semester, we began our project with an interest in land and property in Ecuador. A particularly salient issue because of the uneven distribution of land ownership. As you can see, the current distribution of ownership shows that a lot of the small-scale farmers have very few land versus very little large-scale farmers have most of the productive lands in Ecuador. So
the pink bar is the number of farms that exist. And the gray bar is the amount of total farmland that those farms actually occupy. So that top bar, which is the smallest size farms, there's a bunch of them, but they're occupying a very little amount of space. And so what we're seeing is...
Thank you, Jay. So I was particularly interested in connections between the aggregation of productive agricultural land into the hands of few owners and the shift in national agricultural production towards export crops. And Tate was interested in the systems of urban property and their relationships to housing, particularly to the prevalence of indigent living conditions, yet with the absence of concerted urban housing justice movement. we were trying to understand the market, San Roque market, as a nexus of flows and networks that could connect our seemingly disconnected interests. Can we see all the struggles and the tensions that we have mentioned so far as interconnected? And how can such interconnections be represented or communicated? And what kind of action would a sense of interconnection inspire?
So again, we're still kind of reviewing a little bit of the work we were doing last semester. And we were wondering whether the historical production of this uneven distribution of land could help reveal such linkages. And then, as we kind of moved on and did fieldwork in January and have developed a proposal since then and kind of broadened this interest of these different struggles that seem disconnected, we've kind of brought those into this idea of historical land distribution as well. And so the research on land history that we have aggregated is largely based on secondary sources, but we're also indebted to some of our friends and collaborators in Ecuador, especially Veronica and Stalin, who gave us fascinating and detailed crash courses in Ecuadorian history. I'm sorry that they can't be here. That was really great. And in the spirit of experimenting with representation and communication, what we've tried to do is condense our research into a short animation that recounts the history of social formations that have influenced the patterns of land ownership in Ecuador. This is the first time either of us has made an animation on Adobe After Effects, which we taught ourselves as we went along. So the animation we're about to play is actually still very much in process and has not gone through all of it yet. And we very much look forward to your comments on what kind of was and was not effective about it. For people that were here at the midterm, we had already kind of started making these diagrammatic representations of social formations and land distribution. And so we've begun to try to animate them. Of course, like everything else in this project, it's taken about 10 times longer than we thought. So we'll show you what we have. And
Nadia graciously offered us her beautiful voice to narrate this story.
The Ayllu is a territorial form of indigenous social and political organization that organizes people, land, and other resources. Households within the Ayllu each have the rights to use and cultivate their lands for their own subsistence. But the territory and resources were overall held communally. Households were held together within the Ayllu through kin networks. The oldest males managed household labor and the organization of households across the territory. Ayllus were not solely agriculture-based. Quito had existed as a center of commerce for hundreds of years before the Inca arrived. Inca conquest superimposed a larger political and religious system onto the existing Ayllu organization. The Inca Empire demanded tribute from the Ayllus they conquered in the form of surplus crop production, and in the form of labor, which was called the mita. The mita labor was used to build public works and infrastructures. However, the Inca only ruled for a short period. Internal fighting made the empire particularly susceptible to rapid overthrow by the Spanish conquistadors. During the colonization of Latin America, the Spanish crown claimed administrative rights to all lands. Grants for lands deemed unoccupied by indigenous groups were given to some conquistadors. Lands that were occupied by indigenous groups were given to conquistadors as encomiendas or protectorates. The encomienda was a feudal system of organizing land and labor through debt relations. Indigenous groups continued to work their lands for subsistence, but now owed a debt tribute in the form of agricultural outputs and labor to the encomendero instead of the Inca. In return, the encomendero owed their encomienda protection as well as Spanish language and Catholicism. The encomenderos in turn owed tribute to the crown. The encomenderos could not legally live on or inherit their protectorate lands. Many lived in Quito or on other private property land that they had been granted or purchased. The private property bought with the encomienda wealth was inherited, making the encomienda system integral to the aggregation of property by the light-skinned elite class. The exploitative labor practices and debt-based dispossession drove some indigenous people from their land and also contributed to the conditions of widespread indigenous death, thus depopulation.
So we were able to cover only up until the encomienda so far, and we would like to go through the other historical periods as well. So we covered the first three, and I would want to continue with the remaining also. So after the encomiendas, we have the hacienda system. Haciendas emerged through the transition of land grants into truly private property and the purchase of lands that became unoccupied with a decrease in the indigenous population. The hacienda system was also built on debt relations. Only now, the debt was for land access, not for protection. The indigenous laborers living in that peonage were called Huasipungueros after the name of their Huasipungos. The Huasipungueros received a minuscule wage, used rights to a small plot of land for their subsistence and access to resources like water and firewood. To pay their debt, they worked the hacendados fields while their family did domestic labor. Waves of indigenous workers ran from the haciendas because of the exploitative labor conditions and the inability to keep up with their debts. Unscrupulous land dispossessions and illegal purchases also pushed indigenous groups off their lands and into the growing population of migrant workers. Migrants either traveled between haciendas as wage laborers or went to the cities in search of work. The wealth accumulated through the haciendas cycled through the cities where many hacendados lived, creating opportunities for work. Hacendados also frequently invested in purchasing more rural lands, furthering the inequalities of land, capital, and power. Hacendados had to pay taxes to the crown. However, as they accumulated wealth and regional power, they became decreasingly loyal to the crown. The Ecuadorian state, ultimately the crown's own land distribution practices produced new concentrations of wealth and power, leading to the crown's overthrow. With the formation of the Ecuadorian state, power was based entirely on land, as only landowners could vote. The inheritance of private property further amassed power into the fewer hands. The largest source of state income was indigenous tribute, which was levied in addition to the exploitative system of hacienda del peonage. In the 1850s, the del peonage system was abolished in the name of assimilating the indigenous population. Effectively, this meant a shift from debt relations to wage labor relations. This freed the laborers from the land. The now huge migrant labor force was advantages to growing export-oriented agribusinesses, which needed laborers to freely move around the country depending on where the most profitable crops were being produced. At the same time, cities expanded their infrastructure, drawing migrants in. Next, we have the indigenous movements had long demanded agrarian reforms, as we saw in Masum's presentation, to return to their dispossessed land. In the 1960s, the first agrarian reform passed, in no small part because the elite class was relying less on agriculture in the Sierra. Instead, their wealth was coming from agribusinesses on the coast and businesses in the cities. Agriculture and urbanization were becoming increasingly structured by foreign capital and global economy. Through the agrarian reform, the state broke up large properties in the Sierra and redistributed them to indigenous farmers and other lower-class peasants. However, the recipients were generally given the least productive lands, while elite landowners kept their most productive lands. These small and unproductive lands could hardly provide a family's subsistence needs. Subsistence became even less possible as small lands were further divided through inheritances between multiple offsprings. Thus, even farmers who received land through the reforms had to continue to rely on family members taking wage labor work on larger farms. Or else farmers and families migrated seasonally to cities where they saved wages that were then brought back to their farms. Others simply sold and left their lands, moving to the cities permanently. This led to the second agrarian reform, where the proliferation of smaller and less productive lands resulting from the last agrarian reform produced the conditions for a second reform. This time, unproductive lands re-aggregated into larger productive lands in the name of modernization. However, this affected the coast far more than the Sierra, where the concentration of smaller plots and fragmentation continued, as the larger landowners had no interest in reappropriating unproductive land. As Quito grew, the elites left the historic district, where their wealth and attracted new migrants, for new, more modern neighborhoods. The elites and upper middle class remained the landowners in their old neighborhoods, extracting rent from migrants and lower class residents. In the 1960s and 80s were marked by the restructuring of Ecuador's export economy. This increasing reliance on oil and the modernization of agriculture decreased the number of necessary agricultural laborers. Unemployed migrants flocked to informal settlements around the largest urban centers. Meanwhile, indigenous groups in the Amazon were dispossessed of their lands in the name of oil production, and migrant workers from the Sierra and the coast flowed towards oil-based wage labor opportunities. State-appropriated oil rents were invested into domestic infrastructures and industrialization. Foreign investment focused on Quito, as a center of political and administrative power where substantial banking and service businesses emerged, and we saw this beautifully presented by Zani also. And I mean, post-neoliberal, there's nothing to say about it other than it's an accentuation of the neoliberal.
As other groups talked about as well. So what you can kind of, or I hope at least has come across as what we've been trying to do is figure out simpler ways to communicate complex narratives, although as you can see by the end it still gets very complex, although hopefully with the animation you got the idea of what we're kind of trying to play with and are going to continue playing with. And we also need to say that of course it'll be translated into Spanish when it's done. But through this process of research and both the creation of the animation, we came to see patterns of land, labor, and capital as produced by scalar configurations of power, which they in turn reproduce and restructure. Eric Swingadao explains scalar configurations as the products of sociospatial relations that operate over certain distances. We also can't deny that we had a little help in this understanding from Henri Lefebvre, who in the production of Space writes that power, meaning the unification of ideology and political practice, holds earth, labor, and capital together and reproduces them, whether in conjunction or disjunction separately. So we see Quito's markets as existing within this history of land distribution, processes of land distribution. And they are themselves the products of struggles over land, labor, capital, and power that have played out across various scales. And so moving on to another kind of attempt at representation. Again, a lot of this you'll see is sort of us working through these ideas, and that's kind of been very important to our process is creating these. So this was one of the ways when we were first trying to think of Quito as sort of a multi-scalar or trans-scalar space. And we also refer to Doreen Macy, who says that places can be imagined as articulated moments in networks of social relations and understandings, but where a larger proportion of those relations, experiences, and understandings are constructed on a far larger scale than what we happen to define for that moment as the place itself. So going back to the diagram, I think between kind of the history of land, looking at sort of how the market is situated historically, and these diagrams we're looking a little bit more at a like spatial snapshot, which of course is problematic in its own senses. Where that's what we're trying to represent, that kind of nested scalar configuration. One thing that we're trying, or we thought was important to show here, and again returning to Macy, is how the market is constructed by larger scales of flows and networks and meanings that exist within the market walls, which returns to the idea of what is inside and outside the market that was being talked about before. And yeah.